Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. The Battle of Quebec, 1759. The air was heavy with mist, and the St. Lawrence River ran dark and restless. On its shores the fate of empires waited. The year was 1759, and the world's two greatest colonial powers, Britain and France, were locked in a struggle that stretched from the Caribbean to India, from the forests of North America to the waters of the Atlantic. But here, on the edge of New France, it would be decided in blood. This is the story of the Battle of Quebec, a battle fought not just with muskets and bayonets, but with endurance, cunning, and the lives of ordinary men. It is the battle that would transform North America forever. In the mid-18th century, Canada was not yet a nation. It was a sprawling frontier, claimed by France but bitterly contested by Britain. For decades, both empires had expanded their settlements, pushing into forests, building forts, trading furs, and clashing with native peoples. But the 7 Years' War, which erupted in 1756, turned skirmishes into global conflict. By 1759, Britain had the advantage at sea. Its Royal Navy prowled the Atlantic with near impunity, strangling French supply lines. France, overstretched and fighting in Europe, could not reinforce her colonies. New France was isolated, its soldiers and civilians left to fight on their own. Yet Quebec remained a formidable bastion. The city, perched on cliffs high above the river, was the key to all of New France. Capture it, and the British would split the colony in two. Lose it, and France's North American dream might survive. Both sides knew it. Both sides prepared to gamble everything. In the spring of 1759, British Prime Minister William Pitt, known as the Great Commoner, set his eyes on Quebec. He entrusted the campaign to a young and ambitious general, James Wolfe. Wolfe was just 32 years old. Thin, pale, plagued by ill health, he hardly looked like a man destined to command a great army. But what he lacked in strength, he made up for with drive. His men knew him as relentless, impatient with incompetence, ruthless in discipline, and obsessed with honour. Facing him was Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, the French commander in North America. Montcalm was the opposite of Wolfe in many ways. Experienced, pragmatic, cautious where Wolfe was reckless. A career soldier, Montcalm had seen Europe's great wars and understood the balance of risk and reward. He too was only in his 40s, but already carried himself with the air of a man weary of politics and war. Two commanders, two styles, one battlefield. Wolfe's army assembled at Louisbourg, the great fortress captured the year before. Nearly 9,000 men, British regulars, colonial militias, and marines, along with a fleet of 22 ships of the line and dozens of transports under Admiral Charles Saunders. It was a massive force, one of the largest Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. As they sailed up the St. Lawrence in June, the soldiers marvelled at the scale of the task ahead. The river was treacherous, its currents unpredictable, its banks watched by French scouts. Navigating such waters in great wooden ships, without modern charts or engines, required daring seamanship. The St. Lawrence River is no ordinary waterway. To reach Quebec from the Atlantic, Wolfe's fleet had to sail nearly 600 kilometres inland, a journey of weeks against currents that twisted like a serpent and through channels strewn with hidden rocks. For British sailors, many hardened on the open Atlantic, it was unlike anything they had faced before. The river narrowed and bent, its tides tugging unpredictably. Sandbanks shifted with the seasons, shoals lurked just beneath the surface, and fog rolled suddenly from the forests, blinding the helmsman. Without modern charts or beacons, seamanship was everything. Admirals relied on local pilots, Frenchmen captured or bribed into service, who knew each bend and channel by memory. At night, lanterns were hooded, signals whispered, for the fleet could not risk alerting French pickets ashore. Imagine the creak of timber as ships of the line, massive hulls carrying more than 70 guns, inch through waters barely wide enough to hold them. Anchors dropped suddenly to halt adrift toward rocks. Oarsmen strained at boats towing frigates against the current. Lookouts clung to rigging, eyes sharp for submerged hazards. It was a feat of seamanship as much as of arms. Each mile upriver felt stolen, and every man aboard knew that a single misjudged current, a single hidden reef, could scatter the fleet in disaster before a shot was ever fired. By the time the masts of Quebec appeared at last on the horizon, Wolfe's army had not yet fought the French, but they had already conquered one of the most treacherous rivers on earth. And when at last Quebec appeared on the horizon, it seemed impregnable. The city rose on cliffs more than 100 feet high, crowned with stone walls and batteries of cannon. The French army and Canadian militia lined the ridges and riverbanks. From above, Montcalm watched, his troops numbering close to 15,000, though many were militia and not seasoned regulars. Wolfe's men, looking up at the fortress city, knew this would not be easy. One grenadier writing in his journal called Quebec a Gibraltar of the New World. The siege began. From June through the summer, Wolfe tried again and again to break Quebec's defences. British warships battered the city with cannon fire, their thunder rolling across the river. Red-hot shot and shells set buildings ablaze, and night after night the skyline glowed with fire. Civilians cowered in cellars as roofs collapsed and churches crumbled. On the ground, Wolfe landed troops east of the city, at Montmorency Falls. He hoped to lure Montcalm into open battle, but Montcalm refused. He knew the cliffs and rivers protected him, and he would not squander his men in rash attacks. Instead, his soldiers harassed the British, using the forests as cover, striking like ghosts. Canadian militia and native allies moved silently through the underbrush, firing from the shadows and vanishing before the redcoats could respond. The British were frustrated. Wolfe tried an assault at Montmorency in July, sending grenadiers across the river to storm French entrenchments. The attack was a disaster. Mud, rocks, and musket fire cut the British down. Over 400 men were killed or wounded, their bodies left floating in the tide. Wolfe himself narrowly escaped, raging at his officers for what he called cowardice and confusion. Morale sank. The summer dragged on. Disease spread in the camps. Dysentery, scurvy, fever, silent killers more dangerous than French bullets. Soldiers grew thin and weak, their spirits worn down by the endless waiting. Wolfe, too, began to despair. His health faltered. He suffered from kidney stones, stomach cramps, and exhaustion. In his tent he wrote grim letters, even offering his resignation. But Pitt's orders were clear. Quebec must fall. And Wolfe knew his reputation, his honour, depended on it. Montcalm, meanwhile, played the waiting game. His strategy was simple: hold out until winter. Once the river froze, the British fleet would be forced to withdraw, and Quebec would be saved. His men built trenches, stockades, and earthworks, stretching for miles along the north shore of the St. Lawrence. He kept his army close to the city, ready to repel any landing. But even Montcalm knew time was not entirely on his side. Supplies were scarce. The militia were weary. The civilian population of Quebec, thousands strong, suffered terribly under the bombardment. Bread grew scarce, and disease spread in the crowded streets. Still, he trusted in the natural fortress of the city. The British, he told his officers, would break themselves against Quebec's walls. But Wolfe refused to give up. In August, he hatched a daring plan. If the French would not come to him, he would strike deep into their territory, devastating the countryside, burning villages and cutting off supplies. His men moved swiftly along the river, torching barns and crops, the air filled with smoke, and French-Canadian families fled in panic. It was a cruel tactic, aimed at breaking Montcalm's will by destroying the land he sought to defend. Yet still Montcalm would not take the bait. He clung to Quebec, unwilling to be drawn out. Wolfe grew desperate. He wrote, "I see the impossibility of doing anything effectual unless the French will give us battle." The campaign teetered on the edge of failure, and then, in September, Wolfe seized his chance. Upstream from Quebec, the river narrowed, with cliffs rising steeply from the shore. It was a place the French considered impassable, guarded only lightly. But scouts reported a small cove with a winding path to the plateau above, the Plains of Abraham. Wolfe realized that if he could land a force there, he might scale the cliffs and catch Montcalm by surprise. It was risky, bordering on madness, to climb in darkness with muskets, packs and cannon in tow, under the noses of French pickets, was almost unthinkable. But Wolfe believed it could be done, and he knew that without boldness, Quebec would never fall. The night of September 12th was clear and cold. The British fleet gathered silently on the river, their sails furled, their oars muffled. In the darkness, thousands of soldiers clambered into boats. Muskets, bayonets, and packs weighed them down. Officers whispered orders. The only sound was the splash of oars and the rush of the current. Downriver, to distract the French, other ships fired, drawing attention away from Wolfe's true target. As the boats glided toward the cliffs, Wolfe himself sat among his men, reciting lines from Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. The words about mortality, honour, and the fate of soldiers seemed to hang in the night air. Some men later recalled the eerie calm of their commander, his voice steady as he spoke of death. Then the landing. Soldiers leapt ashore at the base of the cliffs. Rope and iron nails in hand, they began to climb. Fingers clawed at roots and rocks. Boots slipped on loose earth. One misstep, and a man tumbled into the river below. But slowly, relentlessly, the redcoats hauled themselves upward. Above them, a handful of French sentries heard the faint sounds of movement. They challenged the intruders. A British officer, fluent in French, answered calmly, pretending to be a supply convoy. It was enough. The sentries, suspicious but unsure, hesitated. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. Wolfe's army was on the plateau. At dawn, Montcalm awoke to shocking news. The British were on the Plains of Abraham, less than a mile from Quebec. He was stunned. For months he had held the high ground, safe behind his defences. And now, in a single night, Wolfe had outflanked him. The British stood on open ground, blocking the path to the city. Montcalm had a choice: retreat to wait for reinforcements, or attack at once. To wait was prudent, but panic gripped Quebec. Civilians, already exhausted by bombardment, now saw the enemy at their gates. Militia clamoured to fight. Montcalm, fearing the collapse of morale, decided to act. He ordered his army forward. The stage was set. The British, arrayed in two lines, waited silently on the Plains of Abraham. Nearly 5,000 men, muskets primed, bayonets gleaming in the pale morning light. Wolfe moved among them, frail but determined, urging calm. "Steady, boys, steady," he murmured. Across the field, Montcalm's French troops advanced. They came on fast, drums beating, colours flying, muskets crackling in ragged volleys. Canadian militia and native warriors filled the gaps, their fire scattered but fierce. The French line surged forward, a wave of blue and white coats determined to drive the British back into the river. But Wolfe had prepared his men. He ordered them to hold their fire until the enemy was close, dangerously close. Musket balls whistled overhead. Men fell, blood staining the grass. Still the British line held 50 yards, 40, 30. Then the order. A thunderous volley erupted as one. Thousands of muskets fired in a single deafening crash. The effect was devastating. Whole ranks of French soldiers crumpled, torn by lead. Smoke billowed across the field, choking and blinding. Another volley followed, then another. Bayonets gleamed as the British line surged forward, driving into the shattered French ranks. The battle for Quebec had begun in earnest. The musket smoke clung to the plains of Abraham like a choking fog. Men coughed, stumbled, and vanished into the haze, only to reappear a moment later, running, shouting, bleeding. Through it all, the British line advanced with grim precision. Their bayonets were fixed, their red coats spattered with powder and sweat. Each volley ripped through the French ranks, tearing gaps that could not be closed. Montcalm's army wavered. The first shock of that disciplined fire had broken their rhythm. Canadian militia fired wildly, their aim disrupted by panic. Native warriors, masters of forest fighting, but ill-suited to the open plain, melted into the tree line. The French regulars, the backbone of Montcalm's force, fought bravely, but they too faltered as comrades fell in heaps at their side. Wolfe, at the head of his grenadiers, pressed forward, his voice cut through the din. "Push on! Push on!" And then, in the chaos of battle, fate struck him. A musket ball slammed into Wolfe's wrist, shattering bone. He wrapped it hastily, refusing to leave the field. Moments later, another ball tore into his side. He staggered, pale, clutching at the wound. Still, he pressed on, urging his men to hold the line. And then the third shot. It struck him in the chest. James Wolfe collapsed. His officers rushed to his side, carrying him to the rear as battle thundered on around them. He gasped for breath, his uniform dark with blood. Soldiers bent low, trying to hear his words. "Support me," Wolfe whispered. "Let not my brave fellows see me drop." They propped him against the ground, his head cradled. He drifted in and out of consciousness, asking hoarsely, "Who advances? Who advances?" When told that the French line was faltering, that they were giving way, Wolfe rallied his last strength. "Now God be praised," he murmured. "I will die in peace." And with that, James Wolfe, 32 years old, commander of Britain's greatest campaign in North America, fell silent. Meanwhile, Montcalm rode among his men, desperate to stem the collapse. He spurred his horse forward, waving his sword, urging the French to rally. Smoke swirled around him, musket balls snapping close. He must have known the battle was slipping away, but he would not abandon the field. Then he too was struck. A musket ball tore into his body, ripping through his ribs. His horse reared wildly, carrying him back toward the city gates. Soldiers and civilians rushed to help as he slumped in the saddle, blood soaking his coat. They led him into Quebec, where he was carried into the Ursuline convent. As surgeons probed the wound, Montcalm asked simply, "How long shall I live?" When told he would not survive the night, he nodded. "So much the better," he whispered. "I shall not live to see Quebec surrendered." Back on the plains, the French line collapsed. The British pressed forward with relentless discipline, bayonets thrusting, muskets flashing in close volleys. The French tried to hold, but each attempt broke against the wall of red. Soldiers fled in confusion, abandoning the field. The Canadian militia scattered into the woods, while French regulars retreated in disorder toward the safety of Quebec's walls. Many dropped their muskets to run faster, tripping over bodies and gear. Officers shouted, cajoled, begged, but panic spread faster than commands. By mid-morning, The battlefield belonged to Wolfe's army. The scene was ghastly. The grass of the plains was trampled and soaked in blood. Men writhed in agony, crying for water, for mothers, for priests. Limbs were shattered, faces torn away by musket fire, the acrid stench of powder mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Surgeons set up makeshift stations, sawing through bone, their aprons soaked red. Flies swarmed to the carnage. Soldiers moved among the fallen, some offering comfort, others stripping the dead of powder and shot. For many of the French wounded, there was no mercy. Abandoned in the retreat, they lay helpless as British bayonets searched the field for stragglers. Not all were spared. It was the brutal truth of the 18th century warfare. Inside Quebec, panic spread like wildfire. Civilians crowded the streets, watching as the defeated soldiers poured back through the gates. Mothers searched for sons, wives for husbands, but the answers came only in sobs and silence. Montcalm, gravely wounded, was carried to his bed in the convent. Priests gathered at his side, whispering prayers. When told he had only hours left, he spoke calmly. "I am happy that I shall not live to see the surrender of Quebec." Through the night, his breathing grew shallow. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Montcalm died. He was buried quickly in a shell hole within the city walls, the earth trembling still from British cannon fire. For Wolfe, death had come with triumph. For Montcalm, it came with despair. Together, their names would be forever entwined. Two commanders who met their end on the same battlefield, their legacies carved into history. The French army, leaderless and broken, could not hold Quebec. In the days that followed, British guns tightened their grip, hammering the city from land and river alike. Food was scarce, morale shattered. Without Montcalm, command fell into confusion. On the 18th of September, 1759, just 5 days after the battle, Quebec surrendered. The white flag rose over the battered walls. British troops marched through the gates, drums beating, colours unfurled. For the civilians of Quebec, it was the end of one world and the beginning of another. But victory had come at a terrible price. Wolfe's army had suffered heavy losses, more than 600 killed or wounded. Officers mourned their commander, carrying his body back across the Atlantic. In Britain, news of the victory was greeted with jubilation, tempered by grief. Wolfe was hailed as a martyr for empire, immortalised in paintings, poems and memorials. France, by contrast, was shattered. The loss of Quebec cut the heart out of New France. Though Montreal held on for another year, the colony's fate was sealed. To understand the human toll of Quebec, we must pause here, to hear the voices of the men who fought. Imagine a British grenadier, his musket hot in his hands, bayonet slick with blood. He has travelled across the ocean, endured disease and hunger, seen comrades fall beside him. Now he looks across the field, at the broken French line, scarcely believing they have won. Or a Canadian militiaman, a farmer, a father, who stood on the plains that morning, musket shaking in his hands. He had no uniform, only the homespun clothes of the countryside. When the volleys tore into his ranks, he fled, heart pounding with shame and terror. That night he returned to find his farm in ashes, his family scattered, and the civilians of Quebec, women and children who crouched in cellars as shells screamed overhead, who buried their dead in hurried graves, who now faced a future under British rule. The weapons of that day tell their own story. The British infantry carried the Brown Bess musket, a 75 caliber smoothbore, heavy and brutal. At close range, it could tear through flesh and bone with devastating effect. The men fired by volley, shoulder to shoulder, the recoil jolting their bodies, the smoke blinding their eyes. After the third or fourth shot, barrels grew too hot to touch, and soldiers bit cartridges with bleeding mouths. The French bore similar arms, their Charleville muskets only slightly lighter. Both sides fought with bayonets, 20-inch steel blades fitted to the muzzle, turning the musket into a spear. In the final push, the clash of bayonet against bayonet was intimate and savage, men grappling in the smoke, breath hot, eyes wild. Cannon, too, had their role. Though less decisive on the open plain, they roared from the city's walls, belching iron shot that tore men apart in ghastly showers of flesh and splinters. And yet, for all their power, these weapons were clumsy by modern standards. Accuracy was poor, reloads slow, misfires common. Victory came not from technology alone, but from discipline, timing, and sheer will. The British had mastered that discipline. Their controlled volleys broke Montcalm's advance. Their bayonet charge sealed the rout. It was a lesson in the deadly efficiency of linear warfare. Lines of men moving as one, their muskets an extension of command. But discipline came at a human cost. Soldiers drilled endlessly, punished harshly for mistakes, their individuality crushed in service of the line. In battle, survival meant surrendering to the machine of war, trusting that cohesion would triumph where courage alone could not. At Quebec, that machine had worked with terrible effect. The legacy of the battle spread quickly. Across Europe, newspapers carried the news. Quebec had fallen. In Paris, shock and despair. In London, celebration and mourning intertwined. The death of Wolfe became legend. Benjamin West's famous painting, The Death of General Wolfe, immortalized him as a Christ-like figure, surrounded by grieving comrades. The reality, a young man bleeding in the mud, gasping for breath, was far less noble. But legends are rarely built on reality alone. For the French, Montcalm too became a symbol of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. His tomb in Quebec became a site of quiet reverence, even under British rule. And yet, for all the drama, the battle was only the beginning of the end. Though Quebec surrendered, France did not give up the fight. The following spring, French forces tried to retake the city, launching a desperate assault in snow and ice. But without reinforcements from Europe, without supplies, the effort failed. By 1760, Montreal too had fallen. All of New France was ceded to Britain. At the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France surrendered its claims in North America, retaining only a few Caribbean islands. An empire that had stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to Hudson Bay was gone. The consequences were enormous. For Britain, the victory at Quebec cemented its dominance in North America. The colonies along the Atlantic seaboard no longer feared French encirclement. The path was open for expansion westward, a tide that would soon sweep across the continent. For France, the loss was catastrophic. It shifted focus to Europe and the Caribbean, leaving behind only memories and the faint echo of a vanished empire in Canada. For the indigenous peoples of the region, the outcome was disastrous. Many had allied with the French, believing their presence a counterweight to British settlers. With France gone, their lands faced relentless encroachment. Promises made in smoke-filled councils were broken in ink on British treaties. And for Canada itself, the battle marked a turning point, the beginning of a new identity, shaped by conquest and resilience. The Battle of Quebec was not the bloodiest engagement of the 7 Years' War, nor was it the largest. But in its symbolism, in its consequences, it was decisive. 2 commanders dead, 2 empires reshaped, 1 city transformed forever. It was the moment when the fate of North America shifted irreversibly, and its echoes can still be heard. The guns had fallen silent, but the smoke lingered over the St. Lawrence. The battlefield lay strewn with corpses, the cries of the wounded carrying faintly on the wind. Quebec had fallen. Its walls were breached not by storming ladders or exploding mines, but by nerve, discipline, and the finality of musket volleys fired at point-blank range. And yet the victory was far from clean. For both British and French, the days after the battle brought sorrow more than triumph. The war was not over. The wounds ran deeper than flesh. The people of Quebec awoke to a new world. In the battered convent where Montcalm had breathed his last, the nuns now tended not only French wounded, but British soldiers as well. In the shattered homes of the lower town, families picked through rubble to find what little could be salvaged. The British occupation began cautiously. Officers sought to restrain their men from plunder, mindful of the delicate balance between conqueror and conquered. Yet tensions flared. Civilians spat at redcoats in the streets. British patrols eyed the townsfolk with suspicion. To those who had endured months of bombardment, hunger and fear, the Union Jack flying above Quebec was not a liberation, but a wound. Still, there was a strange quiet in the city. The pause that follows calamity, when even grief is muted by exhaustion. The dead of the plains were gathered, heaped into shallow graves dug hastily in the stony soil. Priests prayed over French bodies, British chaplains over redcoats, though in death the two armies lay side by side. Soldiers who had faced each other in fury now shared the same earth. Accounts tell of men who returned to the field days later, seeking lost comrades. They found only scavengers and decay. Muskets splintered, hats torn, bayonets bent in the clay. The battlefield was a ruin, and yet it carried the echoes of order. Lines still faintly traced by the positions where men had fought and fallen. For Quebec, the memory would never fade. The ground itself became sacred, haunted by the spirits of Wolfe and Montcalm, their names whispered as symbols of courage and loss. The winter that followed was merciless. With the city under British control, supplies ran thin. Food shortages bit hard, and civilians faced famine. Many who had survived the siege now perished in the cold months after. For soldiers, the hardships were no less severe. Frostbite blackened toes and fingers. Scurvy gnawed at the strength of regiments. Wolves prowled near the outskirts, feasting on what the earth still yielded of the battle dead. This was the other side of victory. Survival in a land indifferent to conquest. The empire had changed hands, but the ice and hunger cared nothing for flags. Yet even as Quebec struggled, the wider war continued. French commanders, unwilling to concede, planned a counterstroke. In April 1760, with the thaw, they marched on Quebec in a final desperate bid to retake the city. The Battle of Sainte-Foy that spring was bloodier than the Plains of Abraham. French forces inflicted heavy losses, pushing the British back toward the city walls. For a moment it seemed Quebec might return to France. But the Royal Navy once again tipped the balance. British ships sailed into the St. Lawrence, bringing reinforcements and cutting the French lifeline. Outnumbered and undersupplied, the French fell back. By September 1760, Montreal too surrendered. With it, all of New France passed into British hands. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed what had already been decided on the battlefield. France relinquished nearly all claims in North America. The dream of a French empire stretching from Louisiana to Quebec was gone. In its place, Britain stood supreme. But supremacy bred its own problems. As already mentioned, for the indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, the fall of Quebec was a disaster. They had long balanced French and British power, playing one against the other to preserve autonomy. With France gone, British colonists poured westward, hungry for land. Promises to native allies were broken, treaties ignored. Within a year of the treaty, unrest exploded in Pontiac's rebellion, a war born of betrayal and desperation. The battle that had seemed a triumph for Britain also planted the seeds of new conflict. And in the 13 colonies to the south, the victory had its own strange consequences. For decades, American colonists had relied on Britain's armies and fleets to shield them from the threat of New France. The fall of Quebec removed that danger. No longer did they fear French raids on frontier towns or massacres of settlers. Freed from the shadow of France, the colonies began to look differently at Britain's rule. Taxes imposed to pay for the 7 Years' War stirred resentment. Colonial assemblies grew bolder, less willing to bow to Parliament across the ocean. Without Quebec, there might never have been a Boston Tea Party or a Lexington and Concord. The road to American independence, paradoxically, began on the slopes of the Plains of Abraham. But for Canada, for the land that would one day become a nation, the fall of Quebec was the defining moment. Under British rule, French-speaking settlers endured suspicion, prejudice, and the challenge of preserving their culture. Yet they endured. Catholicism remained strong, French language survived, and a new identity began to form. In time, Canada would grow not as a French colony or a British one, but as something unique, a hybrid, forged from conquest and coexistence. The battle then was not just a military turning point. It was the crucible of a national identity. And what of the two commanders, Wolfe and Montcalm? Their deaths elevated them beyond ordinary generals. In Britain, Wolfe was celebrated as the young hero who died at the moment of victory. His portrait hung in halls, his name carved into monuments. He became a symbol of sacrifice for empire. His frail body transformed into the myth of noble courage. In Quebec, Montcalm too was revered. Though defeated, he was remembered as a man who had stood firm against impossible odds, who had given his life defending New France. His grave within the walls he failed to save became a place of pilgrimage. Strange, perhaps, that two men who fought as enemies should be remembered with such symmetry, and yet it speaks to the deeper truth of Quebec, that honour and tragedy walked hand in hand, and that death, in the end, made legends of both. Even today, standing on the Plains of Abraham, one can feel it. The grass rolls gently, the city rises in the distance, the St. Lawrence gleams below. It is peaceful now, but the ground carries memory. Every gust of wind seems to whisper with the cries of the wounded. Every shadow recalls the moment Wolfe fell, the moment Montcalm was carried dying through the gates. History is not silent here. It is alive, pressing close, reminding us that the fate of nations can be decided in minutes by men no different from ourselves. The battle's lessons endure. That courage can falter, but discipline can prevail. That victory may be bought at the cost of a commander's life. That empires rise and fall, but the people who endure them shape the future in ways no general can predict. The men on those plains in 1759 did not know they were making history. They thought only of survival, of the next volley, the next command, the next heartbeat. Yet from their struggle came consequences that would echo for centuries. The Battle of Quebec reshaped the map of North America. It set the stage for American independence. It forced French Canada into an uneasy union with British rule, laying the foundations of modern Canada. It signalled the decline of France as a colonial power and the rise of Britain as the greatest empire of its age. For many, it still seems natural to think of Canada as French. And in some ways, that is true. The language, the culture, the spirit of Quebec remain distinct. But the Battle of Quebec marked the turning point when the fleur-de-lis gave way to the Union Jack. After 1759, French authority in North America crumbled. Montreal fell the next year. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded almost all of its territories in Canada to Britain. From that moment, the future of the colony was shaped not by Paris, but by London. Yet the French-speaking population did not vanish. Britain, recognising their numbers and resilience, allowed the Catholic Church to remain, allowed the French language to endure. Over time, a delicate balance formed, uneasy at first, but slowly becoming part of Canada's identity. And as the centuries turned, Britain's grip too would loosen. The colonies in the south broke away as the United States. Canada's path was slower, not through revolution, but through negotiation. Step by step, Britain ceded power. By 1867, Canada had its own confederation. By the 20th century, it was independent in all but name. So when we speak of Canada today, it is not simply French, nor wholly British. It is something born of both. A nation that carries the imprint of conquest and compromise, and one that grew into its own identity long after Wolfe and Montcalm were gone. And in considering the graves of Wolfe and Montcalm, we can reflect that in both victory and defeat, there is dignity in courage. History remembers many battles, some are forgotten, their fields reclaimed by time. But Quebec endures, not because of the number of dead, nor even because of the empire it secured. It endures because it speaks to something timeless, the fragility of ambition, the cost of war, the way a single morning can decide the course of continents. As you listen now, centuries later, consider this. Empires will always rise and fall. Borders will shift. Flags will change. But the human stories remain. The young commander whispering poetry before the storm. The veteran defending a city he knew could not hold. The farmer-turned-militiaman, musket in hand, terrified yet resolute. It is their voices that still echo on the plains of Abraham, and it is their legacy that still shapes the world we live in. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.